My name is Cal Wilson. My height is 510, and I weigh around 175, 180 pounds. I don't step on the scale every day. I've been in fantastic shape for 32 years and have continued to run every day since my high school and college track and field days. I have dark brown hair with some premature gray streaks, but my best feature, according to others, is my emerald green eyes. I work as a detective at the local police department. Our small community has a low crime rate, therefore my work is rather straightforward. My wife's name is Julie Wilson, formerly Julie Vickers. Julie and I were the pair that everyone felt was perfect for each other. God, she's stunning. Long, blonde hair, bright sky blue eyes, and a body capable of ending a war. She is also 32. After college, we decided that it was time to marry, and for 10 years we lived a great life. I took her out to supper and romantic outings many times a year, and not just during vacations. She works as a paralegal for one of the city's 2 law companies. Jimmy Green is a high school quarterback whose bread was always buttered even if he dropped it. In other words, he was the golden boy until he hurt his knee while playing college football. When he returned to town, his father, the town's mayor, opted to hire him in City Hall, which collaborated closely with the sheriff's office. Jimmy had a thing for Julie even while we were in high school. He would take us out on dates and, despite having a partner, blatantly flirted with Julie in front of me and his friend, Cynthia. God bless Julie. She never flirted back. However, part of what he said to her made her blush and me angry. I informed him explicitly that if he tried to flirt with Julie again, he would have to pay. He smiled and told me not to worry, that it was all fun and games. Jimmy and Cynthia had married shortly after graduation, and he had already worked in City Hall for a year. How did they factor into my story? I'll talk about it later. Julie and I were planning a Friday night out when I received a call from Sheriff Barton on my cell phone. He stated he didn't want to disrupt my day off, but I needed to stop by work. When I questioned what was going on, he claimed all of the patrol cars were busy, and they had received a complaint about a domestic incident near my house. Because I was the nearest, he said I could go straight away. Sheriff Barton refused to take no for an answer, despite the fact that I was supposed to be off today. Not wanting to cause a scene, I apologized to my wife, holstered my badge and .3, 5, and 7 Magnum pistol, and went to the address he had given me. Sue Roberts informed me that her husband, Hunter, was beating her again. He was intoxicated as usual and had decided to vent his frustrations on her and their children. It took a while to persuade and drag him to the station. Sue, as usual, refused to file charges. I told her, as usual, to get help for him, and she vowed, as usual, to do so as well as remove all alcohol from the house. I am in despair. Every month or two, we would receive the same call regarding the same scenario. Today, things were a little different. I was working on paperwork at the office until approximately midnight when I returned home and spotted Jimmy and Julie seated on the couch. Julie appeared to have taken another shower since I was summoned. The hair at the back of my neck stood up. What the hell was he doing here, I thought. What is going on, Jimmy? Honey, I whispered, reaching down and kissing her. I am sorry about it. Hunter's been scheduled again, and I'm hopeful Sue will either keep him or get him the assistance he requires this time. Not a problem, sweetheart, she responded with a smile. Cynthia is out of town with her family, and Jimmy called immediately after you left to see if we were planning anything tonight. Yes, man. Sorry for that. I hadn't realized you had a date night tonight. Jimmy shrugged. I suppose you're lucky you phoned. A mischievous grin formed on his face, and I was once more persuaded that this guy was a first-rate jerk. Alarm bells were ringing in my head. Jimmy has always been a snake who believed his feces did not stink. I chose to be courteous. Well, Jimmy, I am sad to hear that. About Cynthia specifically. But if you don't mind, I'd want to take my wife to bed and attempt to compensate for having to work today. Sure. Sorry for that. He hurriedly got up and walked away. I shut the door behind him and returned to Julie. Baby, I apologize for what happened earlier, I said, bringing her into my arms. Next Friday, I'll tell him to bring Bill or Dave instead of me. Okay. Julie understood what it was like to be married to a cop. She smiled. It's all right, honey. Jimmy and I were simply talking, catching up. I smiled. Not a problem, darling. I said, the alarms are gradually diminishing. Nothing in her demeanor indicated that anything else was going on, at least. Maybe I couldn't trust Jimmy, but I could with Julie. Hell, I've trusted Julie for more than half my life. However, that was just the beginning. Over the next 2 months, we managed to schedule 2 dates when I wasn't called away for one reason or another. Julie was losing her anger, as did I. Unfortunately, while I was upset with my supervisor, she was upset with me. I was her husband, yet I prioritized work over her. At least that's what she believed. I couldn't blame her for believing Cynthia had to leave town more frequently once her family moved to the big metropolis. She would leave for extended weekends when they needed something. One Sunday morning, she returned early, and the next thing I know, I had a call from her Detective Wilson. I said, taking up the phone call. "Thank God you have to come here right now," she added, almost screaming in my ear. She was clearly unhappy, so I asked what was wrong. "Just come to my house," she said. "Not at our house. Come to my residence." Was Jimmy in trouble? I was on duty at the sheriff's office and informed Barton that Cynthia had called and requested the remainder of the day off. He had a peculiar expression on his face, but he simply nodded and returned to his crossword problem. So I ran over to Jimmy and Cynthia's and was astonished to see Julie's car in the driveway, which set off a full-fledged klaxon in my head. Cynthia was pacing out front, and I could see tears in her eyes as she hurried up to me as I exited the car. My inconspicuous automobile was actually equipped with a radio and sirens. Lights. I adore my Dodge Charger. "Cal, thank God you are here. I do not know what to do." She sobbed against my chest and hugged me firmly. "Whoa, slow down, Cyn. What's happening?" I spoke in a calm voice. She looked up at me, and I'm sure my expression was confused as I looked at Julie's car, then back at her. Her face turned pale and she covered her lips with her hands. "What's happening here? Why is my wife's car in your driveway? Are you saying you don't know?" Her eyes became as wide as saucers. "No." "What? What the hell is going on here, Sue Ann?" I began to lose my cool again and the alarm rang twice in my head. And then it struck me, bitch. I yelled, snatching my weapon and running for the door. I opened the door and stepped back into the bedroom. As I threw open the door, I noticed a picture. I blinked twice while looking at the frozen lovers. My heart sprang out of my chest when I saw Julie and Jimmy. I holstered my revolver and stared at Julie. I took out my cell phone and began taking photos. I was able to capture 4 photos before they realized what had happened. "I can explain, honey," she murmured as I continued to snap my camera. I ignored her and instead looked to Cynthia, who had followed me. "Sienna, did you know this?" I inquired, ignoring my wife. "Yes, Cal. I did. I swear I thought you did too. I wasn't pleased with it, but I knew Jimmy would need something while I was away." She reddened but held my eyes firmly. "You weren't pleased with it, were you? And you thought I knew?" I inquired, keeping my tone even. "Yes, Julie informed me she spoke with you about it, and since you work most Sundays, she'll be here occasionally," Cynthia cried again. I had no idea how horrible it was until I saw them together. And then an idea struck me. "Okay, what about this? I'll take C into my home. Is this good with you?" Then I asked her. "No, you aren't touching her." Julie and Jimmy appeared to say this in unison. Cynthia glanced at them with hatred before turning to me. "You know what, Cal? I would like you to take me back to your apartment." She gave me a sly wink. "Hell no!" Jimmy yelled, leaping up from the bed and approaching me. I took my weapon. "Jimmy, do not be a fool. What's beneficial for the goose also benefits the gander. How long have you cheated on me with my wife? 2 months." He spoke, his face distorted with dread and hatred. "Since the night I've been summoned to Hunter and Sue's home." I spoke and he nodded. "Yes, that is true. Now stop it." "I'm still yours, Cal," said Julie. "I still love you," Julie implored me. "What? So you can obtain some on the side, whereas I cannot." I looked at her like if she had fallen from another planet. I noticed Cynthia's black locks and the identical green eyes I had. God, she was also stunning. My passion for Julie had almost blinded me to other women, but now I see how things were. I saw Ken in a different light as well. I looked at Julie again. "You despise double standards, right? That's what a double standard is. If you plan to cuckold me with Jimmy, then I'm going to cuckold Jimmy with CNN. Ultimately, justice is justice. I can't believe you kept her engaged in our bed while yelling, 'Cynthia, Jimmy, baby, take whatever you need for a few days,'" I remarked, and C nodded before stepping over to the dresser and retrieving the basics. I took another glance at Julie. What is the actual reason? Julie, what's your job, asshole? She yelled, going on the attack, her face distorted with wrath. You work all the time on our dates, and at least Jimmy is with me. Did you have fun with him in our bed? I asked plainly. The question took her off guard. She paused before she could begin, and her enraged expression was replaced with shame. I knew an answer before she even said it. Yes, she replied in a weak voice. This will be a fantastic start for the campfire. I just nodded. When did you plan to inform me, Julie? When did you file for divorce? Cal, damn it, it's not like that. I love you, but because you work all the time, we have very little time together. But I do adore you. Julie went on the offensive again. As if I'm a cuckold and yet love you. It's okay. No, Julie, you do not love me. Else you would not be cuckolding me, particularly with him. I shot back, and she said nothing in response. She looked at Jimmy. I am going to live with Cal. If you want to stay married to me, stay away till I return. I cannot believe you two. She called after them. We made it to my car without issue, but on the way home, my cell phone called. I disregarded Julie's, but picked up one from the sheriff. Hey, Cal, what is going on? Jimmy recently contacted Sheriff Barton, his maternal uncle. Sir, your nephew has been amusing my wife for the last 2 months. Cynthia realized that I was unaware of it, and it turns out that she is also unhappy with the situation. She and I are on our way to my place right now, and I'm going to take the rest of today off, and tomorrow too. I gave him dirt. Wow, he exhaled. I was scared something similar might happen. Wait, did you know? I shouted into the phone. I'm sorry, son, he started. Leave it alone, asshole, I said back. I disconnected the call before you could say anything else. I then looked at Cynthia. Did you realize he knew? I asked. God, no, she answered, surprised. I just can't believe this. Now she was furious as well. Okay, Cal, when we get back to your apartment, we need to get really screwed. The wrath in her voice turned me on. You're right, I smirked at her. It felt like the first time I saw her as a lady, more than just a friend. But first, I need to make some calls and clean up around the house. Then I am at your disposal, I promised her. Julie called again, just as I was bringing CI and home. What? I spoke angrily. Don't you dare, Calvin Wilson, she shouted into my phone. Either I entertain her or I divorce you. What will you choose? I have photos, remember? I said this in our state. Evidence of a wife's adultery. She was disqualified from a large portion of the property division after a divorce. Julie was so silent that I assumed she had hung up on me. But then she said okay, before terminating the call. I texted her not to come home tonight, then hired a locksmith. My cousin Dennis was the locksmith, and I was confident in his abilities. When he came, he gave Cynthia a quizzical glance. And I was just enjoying a beer when he stepped in. Hi, Dan, I greeted as he walked in. What's happening, dude? He asked. I told him the short explanation and asked him to change the locks and give me 3 sets of keys. I also told him not to give Julie a set if she came in and asked for one. He quickly consented. Blood is thicker than water, Cal, he agreed, and we shook hands. Dennis is one of the good people, and I know I can trust him in any situation. Then I called the furniture company and bought a new double bed to replace the wrecked one. Julian, I did share. C waited patiently for all of this. The movers soon arrived. They removed the old bed and discarded it in the backyard as I had asked, before assembling the new bed at my request. It wasn't cheap, but the end result was well worth it. You see, I had a plan. Actually, I had a few plans. I was hoping that the least violent strategy would be the one I could implement. Dennis completed changing the locks and handed me 3 sets of keys, as specified. I handed her 1 set and winked at her. She smiled back. The furniture manufacturers finished the bed, and I paid them with my credit card. I immediately called my sister Olivia, the bank manager in our town, and asked her to create a new account for me on Monday morning. After explaining the issue, I asked her to transfer 75% of my savings and checking accounts to the new account and thanked her. She was eager to help, but she disliked Julie from the start. It turned out that Liv was an excellent judge of character when everyone who didn't reside there or was staying as a visitor left. It was just Cynthia and me, instead of putting her to bed right away. I led her into the living room where we sat on the couch after I had shut up the house. What we are about to do is petty revenge. Do you know that? I inquired, peering into her emerald eyes and mine. Yes, Carl, I understand. Before we reach the point of no return, I need to ask you something. I took her hand, Ken. You deserved more than Jimmy, and you always have. I'm not sure why you put up with this stuff. Cynthia reddened furiously. He has total authority over the bank accounts. He told me that if I left him, I would be left with nothing. He claimed he knows every lawyer in town and none of them will take my case. He is lying to you. Honey, I murmured, listen to me. Want to get away from him? Do not worry about hiring a lawyer. Simply say yes or no. Do you want to leave that cheating son of a bitch? Yes, but not solely because of the cheating. She burst into tears and pulled up the sleeve of her blouse, showing me the bruise on the top of her arm. I closed my eyes inside. Shit, I replied, shaking my head. That put a new spin on my plans. There is an old boys club in law enforcement around here, and Sheriff Barton and the DEA would not charge Golden Boy unless he destroyed it. He could get away with it. However, I now had evidence that the sheriff was not only aware of the affair, but had also helped enable it by leaving me on the job. Honey, please listen to me. I am a certified Pole in the entire state. Tomorrow, I'll contact a divorce attorney from my wife's competing business. We'll hire a lawyer. Sheriff Barton cannot fire me, and he knows it. I took a deep breath. I genuinely like you, Susan. I have always liked you. You've been one of my closest pals since we were children, and I'm not going to let your asshole husband damage you again with the photographs on my SIM card. You'll have an irrefutable case against him, and you'll get it all with those words. Her eyes brightened. Cal, could you help me? Even if I am aware of this mess? Yes, I would help you. You didn't know that. I did not know. And you didn't realize how deep it went. Now that we know, we'll have to be cautious. I know Sheriff Barton, and I believe he was somehow forced into this issue. I'll call him tomorrow AM to let him know I'm taking the day off. I stated that after we hire a lawyer, we will go to the station jointly. And if you wish, you can file charges against Jimmy for the bruises. Will he even be able to? She started to ask. Yes, he will. After I show him the photos. You see, until we file for divorce, the possibility of divorce will hang over their heads. That is my plan. I grinned as I explained the strategy to her. Cynthia laughed musically. I like how you think. So here I am about to exact a little vengeance before the real vengeance begins. No, it wasn't petty vengeance anymore. Cynthia and I had communicated extensively throughout the years, and we had many interests. From a love of country music and jazz to comparable movie tastes that Julie and I didn't have. My cell phone vibrated at that exact moment. I turned it on vibration, and when I looked it up, it turned out to be Julie's number. I smirked while answering the phone. What happens now, Julie? I inquired in an angry tone. Cal, it is not too late for us. We can discuss it. She repeated it in her whining voice, which I disliked. We can. Will you quit cheating on me? I asked. She began, but I stopped the conversation and shut off the phone before she could call back. What exactly did she say? Ask Cynthia, she said. And that was all the response I needed. I shrugged. We need to discuss our future moves. She nodded. Yes, we do. I can't return to Jimmy right now. What we have is too different for me to be satisfied with him again. I wasn't happy with him to begin with. The rage returned when I realized that my own boss had been involved in this entire fiasco from the start. He had distracted me from Julie, allowing his asshole nephew to seduce her. Julie was not guilt-free. She may have said no to Jimmy. She could have stopped him at any point. We had both been played. But I was significantly worse than Julie. When I informed Cynthia how I felt, she expressed shame and regret. I'm so sorry, Cal, she replied quietly, stroking my cheek. Honey, how did Julie tell you that I was apparently all right with it? How did she describe my feelings about it? I asked. I needed to find out what lies Julie had told her. Basically, she stated that your feelings mirrored mine. Cynthia explained that even if you didn't enjoy it, you tolerated it since you understood she had needs. My rage at Julie was growing. I just nodded. Okay, I'll play detective and uncover all the facts. I explained my plan to her. She giggled as I finished. You're a deceitful bastard, but I still love you, she stated, her eyes blazing with amusement and adoration. And you are the embodiment of a Greek goddess. I said it, and I love you too. We spent the remainder of the afternoon and evening after showering. We tangled ourselves dry and went to the kitchen, where Cynthia had cooked pork chops and vegetables. She utilized a variety of spices she found in her cupboard, and the chops turned out fantastic. The carrots, sprinkled with cheddar cheese sauce, were also delicious, and soon we were both full. We sat down at the table to discuss our future plans. When we had done eating, I commended her cooking abilities and stated unequivocally that she was far superior to Julie. My strategy faltered for a second, and I realized I no longer hated Julie. Yes, she was a disgusting cheater, but she had also brought sin and me together, if unwittingly. No, the very thought of her cheating on me made me angry and promised that she would only get what the court could give her after those images were entered into evidence. Yes, I had a plan, but it would take some time to finalize the details and put it into effect. When we fell asleep, we found ourselves in each other's arms, which Julie detested. She enjoyed having her own place while sleeping. Ken, on the other hand, was the polar opposite. She enjoyed cuddling, and I enjoy cuddling. The only true blessing in our imminent divorces was that neither of us had children. Julie and I, she explained, were simply not ready yet. She wanted to save some money from her paralegal profession, which paid her well, before we tried to have a baby scene. On the other hand, I simply didn't want anything to do with Jimmy's children, and told him so. She stated she's glad she stuck it out after all he'd put up with over the last 2 months, even though he asked her to stay at home and have children. Cynthia is a real estate agent who basically makes her own schedule, and because the real estate market in our once horsey town is thriving, she makes a living. The objective was to remove funds from her and Jimmy's joint bank account. I wanted to get live engaged, but I didn't want the blame to fall on her if something went wrong. She did, however, have her job's sales receipts and pay stubs. We could sue her for her compensation and get him off the hook in any case. So after devising a strategy, we got in the car the next morning and headed to the lawyer's office. We spoke with Phil, her husband, and my brother-in-law, and he accepted our case at a family discount. In other words, he took the case for a cent and a chance to screw Jimmy over. Yeah, Phil didn't enjoy Jimmy's one-time live hit. It was becoming clear that Jimmy had few acquaintances outside of his family. Phil prepared divorce papers for both wives, and I provided him copies of the images from the day before to use as evidence. The time code on them was proof enough, and their confessions about how long the affair had lasted provided Phil some leverage when it came to writing up the formal documents for each divorce. He agreed to acquire some serious dirt on them and serve them tomorrow, Tuesday, after completing his business at Phil's office. We went over to Sheriff Barton's office. "Hello, Bart," I replied as I entered the office. As Cynthia followed me inside, I maintained a calm demeanor and smiled. I texted him the photographs on his phone and informed him that the cause would be revealed soon. I looked at Cyn. "Show him what you showed me yesterday." I nodded towards her arm. She pushed her sleeve up, revealing the bruise from the hold. "Jimmy does this to me practically daily, so since I'm not going back, please delete it. I want to file accusations against him, so that could be a strike." He began, but I interrupted him. "Bart, unless you want those photos, which I just provided you, to be displayed all over the internet and on the wall of City Hall, you're going to arrest and jail this guy. Then you will notify the district attorney that a lawsuit needs to be filed. I know that without that leverage, his garbage will simply be pushed under the rug as usual. I do not want to do it, but if necessary, I will. I spelled it for him. Now I'd like to know your whole role in Jimmy and Julie's romance. If you don't tell me, the photos will still be made public, and your identity will be linked to them as an accomplice." Sheriff Barton was aware that he was on edge. I secretly turned on the recorder in my pocket soon as he began speaking. "Shit, Carl. I apologize for that entire mess of trash." He crinkled his nose. "I should not have allowed Jimmy and Fred persuade me into it, and the mayor too." "How did they do it?" I inquired, lifting an eyebrow. He explained that he and Julie loved each other and that he needed me to get you out of his sight so he could be with her. That made me raise another eyebrow. I was pretty sure Jimmy was lying at that point, but I couldn't be certain. "Go on," I replied, nodding. "So it all started the night I asked you to go to Hunter and Sue's. Jimmy stated that even though they loved each other, they did not want a divorce and wanted to be married to you." He drew a deep, trembling breath before continuing. "He stated that they had agreed with you both that they would be together when you were at work or out from town, and I assumed the case was closed. Well, I had my doubts, but I didn't want to rock the boat. Carl, I knew Cynthia knew, but I assumed you didn't. But because blood is stronger than water, I kept my mouth silent and got you out on every bogus call I could find. Man, you have no idea how much I regret it." I believed him based on the miserable expression on his face. It did not alter the reality that he had betrayed me, but I reconsidered my idea to bury him so deeply that he could never work in law enforcement again. "Bart, I thought of you as family. I suppose you did not feel the same way about me," I said, shaking my head. "No, this justice needed to be complete." No, it was no longer about vengeance. It was going to be justice for everyone. Everyone will receive what they earned. I stepped aside and asked him another question. "Who else know about it besides you?" I asked, and a deer-in-the-headlights expression crossed his face. Julie and Jimmy shared the same expression in the images I had just emailed him. "Remember? Answer truthfully, otherwise everyone will learn about your role as a detective." I had basically mastered my function as a human lie detector. The only person I couldn't recognize was the woman I'd been married to for 10 goddamn years. She really snowed me. In contrast, Barton was an open book. "If I tell you, will you keep my name out? Will you remove the tape from that device in your pocket?" He said you needed to give it to him. He was observant. As a detective, he had to be. It was then that I made the most life-changing decision possible. When it came to Barton's life, I turned off the recorder and erased it right in front of him. "You are free to go, Barton." I nodded. I was going to give him some leeway, but not completely. He'd still have to meet his family once I was finished, but he'd be able to work in law enforcement. Now tell me, who else knows I'm a cuckold? I let out a growl. Only Fred and Jimmy and the other male family members on their side. He said it and later regretted using the word men. I knew where the copies of those photos would go. I smiled and he turned pale, realizing the depth of his blunder. "Shit," he muttered under his breath. "So the mayor knows and let it happen too." So did Judge Green. I nodded, confirming his words. 1 package each was sent to their wives with the slogan, "Your husband knew about it." Janet Green was a good woman and a friend of my parents. They were friends even before she married Fred Green, now mayor of our town. Alice Green, Judge Green's wife, was kind of a bitch, but she too deserved to know what her hubby had allowed to happen. I thought it was odd that Julie hadn't tried to call me today, but that thought barely had time to flash through my mind before my cell phone buzzed. Of course it was Julie. "Detective Wilson," I answered, as I usually did when I was on duty. "Cal, are you at work?" she asked. "Yeah, I'm in Bart's office doing paperwork. What's happening?" I kept my tone casual. "Are you ready to talk yet?" she asked. "What's there to talk about, Julie? I asked about the fact that I still love you. She said about knowing that I know you still love me." That took me by surprise. I realized that despite her shitting on me, I still had some residual feelings for her. "When would you like to talk?" I asked. "I can take the day off, but you won't be able to get into the house. I changed the locks," I told her. "Why don't you let me in so I can at least get my clothes? Then we can talk," she said. I had to agree. "Yeah, no problem. Cynthia will be there too." "She's at work with me right now," said I. I figured that would be a good barrier against temptation. I looked at Ken, and a concerned expression appeared on her face. "Fine." I heard all the tension in the world in that single word from my wife before she hung up. I looked at Barton again. "For what it's worth, does anyone besides the mayor, you, Judge Green, and Jimmy know that I've been hornswoggled by him and my wife?" "No, that's all of us." He nodded. "And Cynthia is here too," he said, trying to engage her in conversation. "She already told me. And the reason is because Jimmy controls all their money." I let out a growl. "Now you're going to send the evidence to the DA?" Bart pulled out his digital camera and took some pictures of the tackle bruise and a few other bruises on her body. Then he checked them and sent them to his computer to compile an email. "Yes, he'll be traveling today. I'll email him after I pick up Jimmy." He nodded. He'd have to do that since he was the only one he could trust besides me to keep quiet about the shit Jimmy had set up. "I'll keep quiet, all right, until it's time to not be silent." "Good. The sooner he's off the street, the better. I'd go myself, but you know that." I shrugged. I didn't want to be associated with his arrest, especially after the news of his affair with Julie went public. "Yeah, I understand. I'm not in favor of what you're doing. But what he did to you, I think, is inexcusable." And beating his own wife is not something I signed up to defend him against. He'll go down for it if I have anything to say about it. If he wasn't family, I wouldn't be helping him. You have to believe that, son, said Barton. That touched me. I'd known Sheriff Stanley Bart Barton all my life, and until yesterday I'd respected and liked the hell out of him. I still liked him now, but my respect for him was riddled with betrayal. I believe you, Bart. I nodded, then stood next to Sin. Now I need to give Julie her clothes and get her out of my house, I said, and shook his hand. Are you coming tomorrow? He asked. No, I'm officially taking a 5-day vacation starting today. I'll be back next Monday, I said, smiling. Okay, that sounds good. He smiled, and I had a feeling that when the dust settled, he'd be okay. But I wasn't done yet. As promised, I sent both Mayor Green and Mrs. Green the email with all JPEGs attached and timed it to coincide with Jimmy's arrest at the hands of his uncle. When we got home, Julie was already waiting for us. Cindy and I walked to the door, holding hands, and just looked at Julie. She had a jealous look on her face. Hi, Julie said, Cynthia. Do you like my husband? I could ask you the same thing, slut. Julie looked at Cynthia with a grin. Now that I was comparing them side by side, CIA was surpassing Julie in terms of lovemaking. Well, ladies, Julie, what were we saying about double standards? I asked calmly, smiling reproachfully at her. Remember, if you weren't sleeping with Jimmy, I wouldn't be sleeping with Cynthia. That stopped her before she even started her line. I continued. Julie, what is there to talk about? You showed me yesterday how much I mean to you. No respect, no love, nothing but contempt. Instead of showing any remorse for what you did, you tried to justify yourself and then you attacked my work. Now take your shit and get out of my house. Julie couldn't hold back her tears any longer and the floodgates opened. I'm so sorry, Cal, she sobbed. She was crying for real. Now. Something I'd only seen a few times before. I messed up. No, you messed up. Jimmy beat Cynthia. Did you know that? I looked at C and who was showing off the bruise on her arm. I know she remembered C and putting on heavy makeup for church, and now she could imagine the bruises under all that makeup. I remember not giving it much thought at the time and remarking to Jimmy that she did wear a lot of makeup. Not long after that, I noticed that she wasn't wearing as much makeup as she used to. My God, I'm so sorry, Susan. I didn't know about that. Julie had this look on her face like she had just seen a ghost, or maybe a vision of the future. If she left me for Jimmy, there was nothing you could have done. Jules since shrugged. But it's over now, and I'm not going to lie. I'm going to do what I should have done years ago and divorce that creep. I'm going to take his ass to the goddamn cleaners. So am I said, looking at Julie. It was time to dictate the terms of her surrender. Julie, we're done. I'm suing for 75% of our joint property. That's enough for you to buy your own place since the house is in my name and rightfully belongs to me. You can keep your car and I can keep mine. The rest will be split 75/25. If you argue with me, those pictures will go to your family. My family and anyone else who is interested. I'd prefer it and quickly and cleanly, but I'll fight dirty if I have to. There's no going back to that. You and I will end this. You already know how I feel about cheating. Julie stopped crying. But I do adore you, she pleaded. No, Julie. If you loved me, you'd respect me and honor the vows we made when we got married. As far as I'm concerned, when I saw you and Jimmy together yesterday, I divorced you. Then in there. All that's left is to make it official. You'll be charged at work tomorrow with infidelity. My lawyer already has the pictures as evidence and will present them in court. I paused and let my words soak in, then continued. Julie, will you give me a divorce so we can move on with our lives? She lowered her eyes, completely mortified. Yes, she said in that thin voice that indicated she had lost. Thank you. Now let's get your things together. After today's revelation, I don't think you're going to want to go back to Jimmy's place, especially since he was just arrested on a domestic battery charge, said I. Yeah, you're right. But where am I going to live? She asked. I left enough money in your account to pay the down payment on the apartment and a few other things. It used to be a joint, but I transferred 75% to an account in my name and removed my name from the joint account. So it's all yours now? I shrugged. I hope things work out for you, Julie. As much as I'd love to hate you, I just can't. We've known each other too long, but I can't and won't forgive what you did to me, to us. At those words, Julie grew sad. She was obviously hurt. But I held back. It was really hard to do, but I did it. Hell, part of me wanted to just hug her and tell her everything would be okay. But I knew better. If she loved me, she wouldn't cheat on me. It was the only thought I needed to finish fighting her sadness and considerable charms. Yes, when viewed objectively and not with a heart full of love, she was no match for Cynthia, all things considered. But that didn't stop her from being magnificent in her own. Cynthia helped us pack all of Julie's things, but it still took damn near forever. By the time we were done, it was too late to find an apartment, and we were in deep shit. We collapsed in the living room, and most of our suitcases were stuffed with Julie's stuff. Her closet was cleaned out, and her dresser and nightstand and makeup table and bathroom sink and, well, you get the picture. I never realized you had so much stuff. Jules. I chuckled as Cynthia walked in and handed us both a glass of beer and then sat down on my lap. Julie watched us with a look of longing on her face. No jealousy for once, just a sense of what she'd discarded. Well, it's been over 10 years since I moved here, and you know, I never throw anything away as long as it's wearable. Julie shrugged, and I couldn't keep from giggling again. I understand. Okay, I smirked. Jules, it's getting late. You can sleep in the guest room if you want. Cynthia leaned in close to my ear. Is that a good idea? She whispered. I don't hate her sin as much as I want to. I cannot. I don't love her anymore, but I still care about her, I whispered back. Then I looked at the hopeful expression on Julie's face. Jule, it's just for one night. You sleep in the guest room, but pack your car in the morning and remember you have to work with the divorce papers. I drove her home. Julie suppressed a sob. Is this really necessary? She asked finally. Can't we just go see your lawyer in the morning and I'll sign everything in his office? I hesitated as much as I wanted to humiliate her. I also remembered the good times we'd had over the years. Damn. Good thing memory is a good thing. I looked at Scene and raised an eyebrow. What do you think? Is it worth it? I asked her. Cynthia looked at Julie and saw the utter despair in her eyes. Then she looked into mine again. I think she's suffered enough already, and yes, I think it will work. I looked at Julie. Great. We'll go to Phil's office in the morning, then you'll sign the papers and we can ask the judge to declare us divorced. We won't go to counseling and we won't have to worry about child custody. So no worries. Julie smiled. She had escaped my wrath for the moment. The dust hadn't settled yet. Hell, the explosion hadn't even happened yet. I see you've already replaced the bed, she said, her voice still low and full of remorse. Yeah, I needed to upgrade it anyway, but I didn't know at the time that Shin here likes to cuddle. If I had known, I probably would have settled for a double. I smiled and couldn't resist pouring some salt on Julie's wounds. She visibly flinched at the prick. I really wasn't such a good wife, was I? She said, apparently feeling the weight of her decisions. No, you were a good wife until you decided to entertain, not just another guy, but an asshole like Jimmy Green. You knew how I felt about him. Well, the day of reckoning is upon him. If you don't want to get crushed, I suggest you get out of town as soon as possible when the divorce is final. I told her in an even voice, emphasizing each. I understand. An expression appeared on Julie's face that spoke of her fear. What do you mean, Cal? I mean what I'm saying, Jules. Look, I have no hatred for you, but there's a storm coming. When the mayor himself allows his son to entertain another man's wife, knowing full well that his son is wrong, there are going to be serious consequences. The fact that he knew about it or even allowed it to happen with his blessing is not illegal. What is definitely illegal, though, is that this husband should be assigned to a job so that his son can do it. I was lying through my teeth, but it was necessary to protect Bart. At least Bart had a conscience, and that was supposed to protect him when I blew this all over town. I know Mayor Green was the one who assigned me Friday night, even though I usually had the night off, and he made sure I was busy on Sundays, too. At those words, Julie's eyes widened. My God. Jimmy used his own father to set us both up. It all made sense, but in a weird sort of way. You see, Jimmy wasn't an asshole by accident. He took his example from his father, who was a contender for the title of biggest asshole in the universe. Mayor Green was definitely an asshole, and he had more than proved it with his actions lately. Yes, Mayor Green was number 2 on my list right after Jimmy Green. But before Judge Green, Bart had crossed himself off the list. But I had a feeling he wasn't going to get away completely unscathed. I pulled out my cell phone and called Phil. "Hey, Cal, how's it going?" he asked, picking up the phone. "There's been a change of plans. Phil, Julie's coming over tomorrow morning with me and CNN, and she's going to sign the papers at your office. Is this good with you?" I informed him of the change of plans. "Sure. I don't see any reason not to, but have her bring her lawyer with her." "I don't want this to come back and bite us in the ass," he said. "Okay, I'll tell her," I nodded. "Thanks, Phil." "No problem, bro. I got your back," he said, and ended the call. I looked at Julie. "Bring your lawyer in the morning when we go to Phil's?" Julie just hummed and nodded. After finishing our beers, we headed to bed. Julie fell asleep in the guest room, and CNN closed the door behind us as we went to sleep in our bedroom. I had a strange feeling that Cynthia and I would be sharing that bed for the rest of our lives. In the morning, Julie called her attorney and asked him to meet us at Phil's office after explaining the whole story to him. He looked at her warily, but said nothing as he went through the papers and evidence in the divorce case. When he was done, he handed the papers to Julie. "This is the best deal you can get, Jules. Take it and run." That was his advice. Julie, God bless her, followed advice. 30 days later, after a cooling-off period, we were officially divorced. Divorcing Julie was not the real battle. No, the real battle was with Jimmy Green and his dad and uncle at City Hall. But thanks to the letter I sent to their wives, we had an ally in Janet Green. Alice Green did not respond, and I figured she had her own plans to do justice to the honorable judge. Judge Reinhold, no relation, reviewed the evidence, and Jimmy was placed under house arrest without bail, thanks to his record, which was swept under the rug until recently uncovered by his own dear mother. You see, Jimmy had a huge trust fund courtesy of Daddy Dear, and that trust fund was being hunted down by Phil, who was now representing Cynthia in her divorce from Jimmy. Jimmy was stupid enough to resist the divorce, so Phil pulled out the big guns and went after the trust fund. When Jimmy pleaded guilty, he was given probation but kept under house arrest. It wasn't ideal, but it had to do for the moment at work. I got a call from Cynthia, who was now living with me full-time, informing me that Janet Green was at the house. I said I'd be right over, informed Bart that I had a sister, and he only nodded and smiled. I hurried home. When I arrived, Cynthia and Janet were having coffee in the living room. "I'm here, ma'am," I said as I entered the house and kissed Cynthia Callie. "It's good to see you. By the way, thanks for that informative letter." She smiled apologetically. "If I had known my son was doing to the two of you with my husband's full knowledge and cooperation, I would have put a stop to it. Ma'am, not many people knew about that." I shook my. "It would be unfair to say you should have known. My brother knew and allowed it to happen." Her voice turned steely. "My husband knew and allowed it. My brother-in-law knew and allowed it. This creature who calls himself my son has overstepped his bounds, this time seducing another man's wife and then using his own family to cover it up. Well, let me tell you that anything I can do, I will do for you." She nodded. I had assumed she would probably support me, but what I hadn't counted on was that she would swear us to it. "Thank you, Janet," said Cynthia, hugging her soon-to-be ex-mother-in-law. "Any time, sweetie," replied Janet with a smile. "Do you think Phil will take my divorce case?" she asked as Cynthia sat back down. "I think he can be persuaded." I nodded and smiled. "Mrs. Green, Janet, Cal, you should know that by now." She smiled, admonishingly at me. "Okay, Janet, I hope you won't think badly of me for taking on Cynthia," I said, a little apprehensive about how she would take the suggestion. "Nonsense, Cal," she laughed. "You two deserve to be happy, and considering what Julie and Jimmy did to you, I have a feeling you both should be happy with each other. I know I could sue Jimmy, his father, and maybe even both uncles for alienation of affection. But why? It's a bullshit lawsuit in most cases, and it's almost impossible to prove. No, what I had planned for Jimmy and his father was much, much worse. After all my investigations into the house, whys and wherefores, I determined that Mayor Green, in collusion with his son, had plotted to destroy my marriage. I considered charging him with bribery, as well as solicitation by proxy. The judge, though knowledgeable, was only guilty of not telling me what I should have known. Julie wanted nothing to do with Jimmy and left town shortly after our divorce was finalized. Her boss found her a good job in another city with an old friend of his from law school. She took my advice and dropped the AOE before the shitstorm destroyed the fan base. Bart fully cooperated with me on everything and apologized to my sister for his involvement in what happened. He confirmed my suspicions that Mayor Green himself had told him that if he didn't go along with Jimmy's plan, he would lose his job as sheriff and be replaced by an idiot of the mayor's choosing. Despite all his faults, Bart had always been a damn good sheriff. Any replacement chosen by Mayor Green would have been bad for the police force. As it happens, Bart and Janet was sitting at dinner one night with Cynthia and me, and we had some damn good fried chicken cooked by Sin herself. Yes, she's great in bed and she can cook, and Jimmy gave her up for Julie. Well, sometimes you can't argue with taste. After dinner, drinking beer, we discussed the plan. I laid out the basics and said the deadline was being pushed back a little so Mayor Green could be served with the divorce papers first. The whole town was going to get a goddamn enema. The first order of business was to contact Phil and see what private investigator had managed to dig up. I called him and the report was good. He'd gotten a lot of dirt on our glorious mayor and his asshole son. Janet had long reproached herself for the way she'd raised Jimmy, but after we assured her he was his father's son, she finally relented. I could not blame her. She told us about how her husband had changed over the years, going from a kind, wonderful man to a backstabbing tyrant. I remember the old saying, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. It applied to Mayor Green and the way he ran our city. In the end, it came down to the fact that by using his son as a proxy, he showed everyone that no woman was immune to him. I felt sorry for Julie when I learned this fact. The taped conversation made me queasy when Phil played it back to us in his office. Mayor Green just divorced her. Jimmy, give that bitch what she wants and I'll run her out of town. Jimmy, but Daddy, she can't divorce me. She's mine, and I can do whatever I want with her. Mayor Jimmy, let's get this over with. People are starting to talk and we need to get rid of this as soon as possible. Don't worry about Carl. I'll get him fired and run him out of town on the rails. We need Cynthia to go with him. You've screwed up enough already. Jimmy, how can you say that? Daddy, you're the one who told me Julie was ready. You're the one who made Bart give him extra hours and extra calls. Mayor, well, you were the one who let her escape. Jimmy, I was in jail, if you don't remember. How was I supposed to know that Cynthia would turn me in for correcting her? Mayor, don't worry about Cynthia. I got plans for that bitch. Take care of yourself and lay low for a while. Jimmy, all right, Daddy. Just make sure she doesn't go through with this divorce. Make it look like an accident. Phil, stop the tape. I looked at Cynthia and Janet, then at Bart. That's enough to prove conspiracy, said Bart, and Phil nodded in agreement. Bart then looked at me. Care to do the honors, son? I grinned and checked my Colt. I'd be honored, sir, grinned I. Then I looked at Sin. Honey, you stay here with Phil. Bart and I need to put some rabid dogs to sleep. Cynthia put her arms around me and kissed me hard, putting her whole heart and soul into that kiss. Be careful, baby, she whispered. I love you. I love you too, sweetie, I said, smiling encouragingly at her. Don't worry, Bart and I can handle it. We got into Bart's car outside Phil's office. He turned on the lights and siren, and we raced toward the mayor's estate where Jimmy now lived. On the way, he called Judge Reinhold, still no relation, and got a warrant for their arrest based on a wiretap of a private investigator. Got to love the Patriot Act. When we arrived, Mayor Green was just finishing dinner with his son, and they didn't even hear us pull up after Bart turned off the siren. We pulled up in front of the mansion and went inside with guns at the ready. Bart proved he still had one when he kicked in the door. What the hell is going on here? Demanded Mayor Green. A look of pure terror appeared on Jimmy's face as he saw my point. .357 pistol and Bart's .44 caliber single barrel pointed at them. I covered Jimmy as Bart moved forward and set the charges. Frederick Green, you and your son Jimmy Green are under arrest on charges of conspiracy to commit murder. You have the right to remain silent if you waive this right. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney and to have an attorney present during questioning. Do you understand these rights as I have enumerated them to you? Bart holstered the Colt and buckled the handcuffs behind Fred's back, making sure they were well buttoned and the keyholes were away from his hands. He then sat the mayor down and cradled Jimmy while I read him his rights and handcuffed him as well. When they were both cuffed and stowed in the back seat of Bart's Charger, we flashed back to the station and processed them. Jimmy, showing rare ingenuity, kept his stupid mouth shut. Once Fred was in the cell and Jimmy in the interrogation room, I went in with Cynthia by my side. I laid out the papers in front of him and then turned on a tape of him confessing in general terms to killing his wife. Jimmy listened to the whole thing and then turned noticeably pale. Every drop of blood turned to ice in his veins as he realized how deep he was mired in this shit. This can't be admissible in court. He tried. It doesn't matter, Jimmy. I shrugged. What matters here is the court of public opinion. If we invoke the Patriot Act, suspecting you and your father of harboring domestic terrorists, and show Homeland this conversation, it could easily be misconstrued as planning an execution as an act of terror. I was talking thick, but I was having a hell of a lot of fun doing it. What do you want me to do? He asked. Broken. He knew we had him cornered, and he knew he was going to get the big green weenie with no lube and a sandpaper condom if he didn't play ball. As soon as your lawyer gets here, you will sign this paper giving Cynthia everything. He'll witness it, and then everything will go to the judge. The judge will give everything to Cynthia. You'll go to jail, and then you'll get out and live your life as it will be. Do you understand how things will play out? I asked, and he only nodded in response. It felt damn good to see Golden Boy go down a few dozen steps. Jimmy, if you hadn't gotten it into your head to seduce my wife, none of this would have happened. You took the wrong man's wife, asshole. Man, I'm sorry, he cried. For the first time I'd ever seen him cry. Jimmy Green was crying. I looked at Cynthia and she looked at me, and our faces expressed pure shock. Then we smiled at each other and looked again at the sobbing, crying, apologizing. Jimmy Green. Shut up, Jimmy snapped. Cynthia, you and your asshole father were going to kill me. You're just sorry you got caught. This brought Jimmy out of his daze. He finally realized what a screwed-up mess he was in, and his brain practically shut down. He just stared at the wall between us. And soon, when his lawyer came in, I played him the tape, and he closed his eyes and let out an intermittent sigh. When I laid out my plan to send the tape to the local news stations and even the major TV stations, he managed to get Jimmy out of his self-imposed state and get him to sign the divorce papers. With Fred Green, we managed the same thing, and he signed the papers without a fight as soon as his lawyer arrived. And since we never wrote that, we would withhold evidence if they cooperated. We went ahead and sent copies of the tape to news stations, the big 3 networks, and even Fox News, and then sent a copy to the State Attorney General's office. It was as if a small thermonuclear device had exploded in our quiet town. News vans were everywhere. Law enforcement from state police officers to the FBI flooded our town, and the motel business was booming for the small farming community. We were raising money for the town coffers, and it turned out to be a heck of a lot of fun for everyone except Jimmy and Fred Green. The feds dug deeper and found some questionable tax practices in Fred's past, and a few odd things in Jimmy's day-to-day dealings at City Hall. When the dust finally settled, Bart was cleared of all wrongdoing. Although Jimmy and Fred tried to throw him under the bus over the scam scandal, but he came out clean. Julie was subpoenaed to testify about the whole thing and was vilified a bit by the assholes at the news until I laid it all out straight and portrayed her as a victim. She was young and naive. I was asked in an interview if I would have reconciled with her, to which I answered with a firm, no, I wouldn't argue with that. Cynthia got everything in her divorce from Jimmy, and Janet got everything, and her divorce from Fred. They got solid prison sentences for their involvement in the conspiracy and other charges that the feds found a way to bring against them. They will likely die in prison when the guilty verdicts and sentences are handed down. Cynthia and I were married, and her relatives came back to town for our wedding. Julie came, having been invited, and brought her new boyfriend with her. I talked to him, and he actually turned out to be a good man. There you go. I was even happy for her. Jimmy found love again, as I learned from talking to him. As it turned out, his cellmate was a very large but very loving man. Jimmy's farts stopped being noisy after his 6 months in prison. Jimmy's uncle, Judge Roy Green, came under investigation along with his brother and nephew, and the feds found some irregularities in his cases and sentences. He was found to have taken bribes and engaged in other nefarious activities. It also turns out that Alice was the one who turned him into the feds. I'm wondering why. Anyway, he ended up at Club Fed after Alice brought him to light during their divorce. As for Fred, the former mayor, he played in many prison musicals, usually singing soprano parts. Julie ended up marrying the guy she brought to see Diane and I's wedding, and they now live in town. From what I hear, she's having a baby. Good for her. Bart retired and is now living out his golden years with his wife. They're empty nest things now, but he still shows up at the office occasionally. I became sheriff after a new mayor was elected mayor. Barton is a divorced woman who, when her ex-husband abused his power, stood up for him, earning the trust of our town. Yes, Janet took her husband's place and appointed me sheriff after Bart retired. Now, here I sit. Years after that fateful day when I was called back from a date night with Julie. And here I am holding my young son in my arms while a very pregnant Cynthia feeds our 2-year-old daughter. And life is good. We've turned the guest room into a nursery, and our toddler has his own room. We have 4 bedrooms, and Cynthia has already made it clear that this will be the last baby. She plans to get her tubes tied after this baby arrives. As she puts it, the baby factory is closing, but the playground will be up and running. I adore my wife. Let me just say this right now. Here is the next story. At that time, I was 30 years old and joyfully married to my wife, who was also 30. We had been together in matrimony for about 6 years. For the sake of anonymity, I'll refer to her as Sarah, which is not her actual name. Our marriage was filled with travels, shared meals, and spending nearly every evening together for those first 6 years. However, I began noticing certain red flags that, looking back, should have clued me in that something was amiss. Early in the year, I had to travel for a work conference, marking the first occasion I'd be away overnight without Sarah. She quickly suggested that her friend, a 29-year-old male who I'll call Mark, not his real name, and with whom she shared a close friendship and a past intimate relationship before our time together, should come and possibly stay over while I was away. I immediately expressed my discomfort with the idea, especially since Mark had not visited our home in the 6 years of our marriage, except for the one time I was absent. Despite her initial anger, she seemed to respect my decision, as far as I could tell from our home security footage. There were other incidents that raised my concerns, but I'll skip those details for brevity's sake. As we are in a movie theater together, I notice her writing messages to someone on her Apple Watch during the movie. This was very unusual for her to do, and the messages, although I can't remember them, were a bit strong for a coworker at a new job, but nothing overtly sexual romantic. I ask her about it after the movie, and she brushes it off. Her behavior changes, sitting away from me on the couch, changing in a different room, and so on. I start to wonder, am I being cheated on or what is being hidden from me? I feel tremendous guilt for even thinking about checking her phone for confirmation, feeling that if I do and I am wrong, there's no point in continuing to be married. After thinking about it for days, I decide to check in January. Now her phone is always close by and I don't know the passcode. Luckily, her watch is accessible and she made the code our anniversary. Irony abound. What I discover next is horrifying. Sarah and Mark discussing her hookups with a coworker, them mocking me for not noticing what is going on. Sarah discussing how the idea of me touching her is revolting, how she can't imagine having kids with me. Then I read the messages between Sarah and the coworker. We will call him Carl. Those messages are explicit, and Sarah shows more affection for him in every way than she shows me now. And each message tells me a new revelation that hurts more. That a trip she said was to console a friend was really so that the friend could meet Carl. That she began changing in the bathroom so I wouldn't see the hickeys on her body. That her therapist knows all of this and says I should be made aware, but that she should be happy with whoever. I stay up till 3 or 4 a.m. reading these messages and taking pictures of everything. I don't sleep that night. My jaw clenched so hard all night it caused issues for months. She leaves for work, I'm off that day, and my first phone call is to a lawyer. What are my options? When I confront her, what can I say, not say legally? I wait for her to come home, reading over the messages to confirm it wasn't the worst dream I ever had. When I confront her, I tell her what I know, without revealing I had been in her texts. I tell her I spotted the hickey, a lie, but she mentioned it in the messages, that I know she's texting someone. Sarah lies, tries to argue it is someone else that gave her the hickey, but finally I read a message from her watch. I guess what I expected was for her to break down, and admit everything. Instead, Sarah explodes in rage that I violated her privacy. The insanity and gaslighting of trying to convince me that I was the bad guy here blew me away. She stormed out of the house and disappeared for 3 days. No communication as to where she was, even though I asked her to tell me where she was staying so I knew she'd be safe. To this day, I only know a small part about where she went or what she did. When she comes back, she tells me she wants to try to fix things and spend some time together. It doesn't go well. I catch her sneaking off to meet with him once again as she foolishly leaves the watch behind, and I can read the messages in real time. I finally tell her in February that I contacted a lawyer. She insists she won't sign anything until we attend couples counseling. I humor it, but it goes off the rails immediately when, after I explain we're here because she had an affair, that she argues my word choice. Affair was too strong a word. She also lies about the fact that she cheated on me before Carl with a married man, something I discovered at a later date going through her watch once again. She admits her plan was to find an apartment, then hand me papers without me ever knowing what is going on. She even tries to blame the whole affair on me, using, in the therapist's view, minor disagreements as proof of my cold and uncaring demeanor. One example, I didn't immediately scream at my parents for a Christmas gift she didn't like, or at her parents when they playfully made fun of her. At this point, the decision is made. I need to divorce her, as she will never tell the truth. We agree Sarah will move out of our house, and I even help her find an apartment. Anything to get her out of the house faster. One day in March, I watch the news of COVID come in and all construction work stops. Her apartment was almost ready but was being renovated. Now there's nowhere for her to go. I'm stuck in the house with her from March to June. For those wondering, she has enough legal knowledge to know that leaving would make her case harder and might still have to pay expenses. Those 3 or so months were hell. Trying to do my job and live in a house with a person who had wronged me and ridiculed me was unbearable at times. We tried as best we could to keep it civil and not scream at each other every time we passed each other. Imagine spending 90-plus days cooking meals, passing by, and seeing no one else in the world but the person who ended your marriage and broke your heart. Every day featured me essentially locking myself in a room for 8 hours, then doing yard work or working out to avoid speaking with her. She moved out for the most part in late June once the world started to open up a bit, and had all of her items out by July. Knowing that I wanted the house, she definitely manipulated the situation to her advantage to avoid her being publicly shamed. Her family to this day doesn't know what caused the divorce. She didn't tell them the divorce was happening at all till after the papers were signed, and essentially forced me to pretend we were still together until then, at which point I told her to tell her parents or I would. They never asked me what was the cause, although 1 or 2 did wish me well. I never felt the need to tell them, as despite the pain and gaslighting she caused, I didn't feel the need to hurt them. Her parents never wronged me. Carl and Sarah didn't last. When I found out, Carl told her to leave me and be with him, but she tried to mend our relationship and he walked away from her, so she ended up with no one. Sarah and I rarely speak now unless it's absolutely necessary, which is rare. I've wondered at times if maybe I was wrong for not publicly outing her infidelity. The people who are important to me know the truth. I also never confronted or spoke to, for that matter, Carl or Mark or her friend, who knew about all of this but never warned me. As for me, I found someone who is truly a good person and have a great relationship. I've never told Sarah, as it's none of her business. Much like telling her family about her cheating, I thought about telling Sarah how well I'm doing, but I think that is just schadenfreude. Thanks for reading, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. Here is the next story. Thank you for taking time to hear today's story. If you loved the story, please like and subscribe if you haven't already. If you have a tale to share regarding your own or someone else's circumstance, please do not hesitate to contact me. Take care.